We're starting a new series today because it's Advent, and in Advent we start new series. And the one we are starting today is based on a song by Maria Carey, actually, which is a bit strange. And the sermon series is All I Want for Christmas Is, and we are looking at different things. And I know all of us in a month's time will all be hating this song. I kind of like it this time of the year. In 2 weeks' time, I'm all right with it. In 4 or 5 weeks' time, I just hate it. So I hope you don't get too tired with us talking about All I Want for Christmas Is. And today we're looking at All I Want for Christmas Is Hope. And as I was preparing this talk, I was looking at what's the difference between hope and expectation? They seem to have some kind of similar meanings. And what does hope mean in our world today? So I went to a dictionary, and the dictionary says that hope is a feeling of expectation and desire for a particular thing to happen. And so therefore hope is kind of like a feeling. And expectation is a strong belief that something will happen or be the case. And as some of you know, I used to work as a football analyst, and part of what we used to do is that we are very accurate at knowing what was the expectation of a result in a football match. So we could say there's actually a 63.5% chance of this team winning, which meant that if you were supporting the other team, even though the odds were against you, you still had hope that your team would win because there was a chance that they would win. And this was all completely math-based and data-based. But as a football fan, every time Argentina plays a World Cup, even though the real expectation might be that there's a 10% chance of them winning, for me, there's always actually an expectation that there's like a 50% chance of them winning. So my hopes are usually quite high. And some people say that having a false sense of expectation is being positive, and others say it's being delusional. But the truth is that unrealistic expectations are potentially damaging because they set us and others up for failure. So what I wanted to talk about today is hope. And what does that mean? Because basically in our world today, hope is a desire. It is linked to an expectation, but at the end of the day, it's a desire. But in the Bible, the Greek word for hope is this word called elpis. And elpis basically means it's an expectation of what is sure. So it's not a desire, it's an expectation of what is sure, what is certain. So hope in the Bible is not a feeling, it's not a desire, but it's actually trusting and having the expectation that God is true to his words. And we're going to base our talk today on Genesis 15, which talks about a covenant. And just for us to understand what a covenant is in the Old Testament, and we're talking about 4,000 years ago or more, they didn't have contracts as we have today, where you both sign or both parties sign, and we have a document that says, well, these are the terms, and we both sign. Actually, what they did were covenants. And covenants were quite different to contracts because they were much stronger than a contract. And how they did it was they'd grab all these animals, they'd grab a bunch of animals and cut them in half. And I know this would be against the law here now, but in those times it was fine. So they'd cut them in half and scatter them around. And what they did is they would then walk around with a torch in their hands around these pieces of animals. And what they were saying was, if I break my covenant, if I break what I promised to do, then I deserve to end up like these animals, broken and dead. So actually a covenant at that time was unbreakable. And the passage we're going to read today shares the story of Abraham. And Abraham had been promised before what we're going to look at today in Genesis 12, verse 3. And God promised, and he said, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And the problem was that he had been promised that everyone would be blessed through him, through his offspring, but obviously he didn't have kids with his wife yet. So he was a bit down, and he was also going through a really hard time in his life. He had done wars and a lot of things. So he seems to be quite low, and if you read the passages, you'll see that he seems even depressed. He's going through a really hard time, but God encourages him, and he believes, and then God proves that he is worthy of his promise. So I'm going to read now Genesis chapter 15, verses 8 onwards. And it says this: "But Abraham said, 'Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I shall gain possession of it?' So the Lord said to him, 'Bring me a heifer, a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon.' Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away." So they're preparing to sign the contract, the covenant. And then it says, "As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, 'Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and ill-treated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure.' When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking brazier with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, 'To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates.'" And then he mentions a few other pieces of land. And what we find there, which is really fascinating, is that there's only one torch going around the pieces of animals, not two, and Abraham is fast asleep. So basically what a lot of theologians believe is that the torch was held by God, and God was going round, and he was signing a covenant and saying, if either you don't do your bit or I don't do my bit, then may I end like these animals, cut in half. And actually, that promise and that covenant was fulfilled when Jesus died, because it wasn't that God didn't do his bit, his people didn't do his bit, but still God was willing to pay the price for that covenant. And that became afterwards a new covenant. But basically what we learn here is that God has always been true to his words. And our hope has a solid foundation. God promised in this covenant that he would be with us, and he did come and then die for us in Jesus. So I'm going to show just a very short video, which hopefully will help us understand a bit more about hope.
In our day-to-day lives, we experience time as a continuous flow. But it can also be useful to think of time as a series of snapshots or moments. And everything that happens can be thought of as the unfolding of moment after moment after moment. And if we picture all moments or snapshots lined up, every moment here on Earth, every moment of Earth orbiting the sun, and every moment throughout the entire universe, we would see every event that has ever happened or will ever happen.
Every location in space and each and every moment in time. To see what I mean, think of space-time as a loaf of bread. Einstein realized that just as there are different ways to cut a loaf of bread into individual slices, there are different ways to cut space-time into individual now slices.
I was studying all of this, and I was kind of trying to get my head around it, and I still find it very hard to understand. But I quite like this image of space-time as something you can go out of and actually look from a different perspective, because it makes me understand that that's how God can see space and time. And actually, if you think about it, if God can see everything and be part of everything, past and future, when he says something, he's also doing the future event at the same time. So therefore, his promises are always true because they are happening as he is saying them. There's a very well-known theologian called Gregory Gansel, and he's in Yale University, and he says the traditional view has been that God is timeless in the sense of being outside time altogether. That is, he exists, but does not exist at any point in time, and he does not experience temporal succession. That means that God is inside and outside time, and therefore he can see from sort of outside time, and therefore everything he promises is already happening. And that's why his promise is always trustworthy. That's why we can always trust what he says, because what he says, in a way, he can already see it happen or can live it out in the future, which I know is a very difficult concept, but it means God is super trustworthy, that what he says is true. And John Piper said, the presence of hope in the invincible sovereignty of God drives out fear. And I love this because if you think about it, if God knows the future and God holds the future in his hands, then there's nothing to fear. But then why should we trust God? Why should we have this hope? Why do we believe this? And this is a whole sermon in itself, and I'm just going to share 4 quick things of why I trust the Bible, why I trust in God, and why I trust his word. And the first one is that he has promised things thousands of years ago that have already been accomplished 2,000 years ago. So we can trust that what he says is true. And actually, I have a list which I'll post on social media tomorrow of 44 prophecies that you can see in the Old Testament accomplished in Jesus. And it's so clear, it's so obvious that he is trustworthy. The second is the resurrection. Jesus' resurrection was witnessed by his followers who died for him, and they were willing to give their life for that truth. And that's why their testimony is so trustworthy, because they were willing to die for what they said. Thirdly, our experience of God. We get to experience God today, and that's why we can trust him for the future. Romans 8:16 says, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. We have our own experience with God, but also we have the experiences of people around us, people we trust, people we know who have experienced God, and that gives our hope a solid foundation. And lastly, reason, and there's many reasons why through reason we can trust God, but the 2 obvious ones are we look at the universe and we look at the detail of everything, and we can't deny that there has to be a creator behind that beauty, behind that detail, behind the immensity and the perfection of the universe. And secondly, if we look at the history of mankind, and there's always been an urge, a hole in the human race, searching for God in different ways, but there's always been that hunger for something more, something bigger than themselves. And that's because God created us for a relationship with him. And Tim Keller, who I love, says, the glory of the Christian life is that we have a hope that overwhelms grief. It doesn't eradicate it, it sweetens it, it overwhelms it. And that's what we're talking about now. That's what we talk about when we say that the light has overcome darkness. Is that in the middle of our hurting, our pain, our grief, we have a hope that is much bigger than that. In Keller's words, the glory of the Christian life is that we have a hope that overwhelms grief. It doesn't eradicate it, it sweetens it, it overwhelms it. It's bigger than any problem, any grief, any sadness we have in our lives. And he also said, God's reckless grace is our greatest hope. Our hope is not even in our action, in ourselves, is in God's reckless grace, in his amazing love, in him drawing close to us. So in the last few weeks at this service, we've seen that God's so generous, it's unfair. We've seen last week that his grace is outrageous. And today we are reminded that our hope is certain. It has a solid foundation. So if what you want for Christmas, and that's the title of our sermon today, if what you want for Christmas is hope, then believe what God has said. Believe in him who is trustworthy. Draw near to him and walk with others who have that same hope. Because our hope is solid. The covenant has been offered to us and the price has been paid. And that's the grace we receive. And that's why it's so amazing. That's why our hope is so amazing. Because it doesn't depend on us. It depends on him. So I'm going to invite us to respond to this and pray. And the main thing I want us to remember is that our hope is solid. That what we believe in has a very strong foundation. And therefore it's worth surrendering our lives to God. That's why it's worth just giving ourselves to him. So I'm going to pray and I'm going to invite the band over to lead us in worship.